with that, let's go ahead and get started. I'm so pleased you're all able to join us today. As we present the surprising science of meetings, evidence-based insights for leaders that help you gain a competitive advantage with our guest presenter today, Dr. Steven Rogelberg. We're so thrilled he could be here. So before we get into the presentation, let's take a second to look at who we have here with us and what we already happen to know about this science. So we asked this question in a survey and when you registered, and what we found was first, we asked you, which best practices do you feel have the biggest impact on meeting success? And it looks like our friends here, all of you involved, are really quite comfortable using an agenda. Many of you pay good attention to only inviting relevant people. Not so many people are down with the tasty snacks. And I have to say this makes me sad because that may be one of my favorite best practices. Tasty snacks are really quite wonderful. But looks like we've got some good grounding here in best practices. On the question of whether or not you had a lot of experience with meeting science, it looks like a lot of you are new to the whole idea of meeting science. So this is going to be a wonderful treat. You'll learn some things you had no idea even existed. Some of you have some exposure to it and you've been applying it. And then we've got at least one meeting scientist on the call. So it'll be fascinating to see the feedback from this expert. And then finally, we said, okay, well, what is your most burning question? When you think about meetings and you're looking for evidence, what's really on your mind? And I've grouped the answers that we got to this into sections. Quite a few of you mentioned accountability, how to get attendees to follow up on deliverables. Engagement was another really common theme. How can you get the highest engagement levels and contributions from attendees? Specific meeting techniques. There were quite a few questions about some very, very specific things, like how to rethink board meeting formats and other things that apply just to special kinds of circumstances. Efficiency. How do you use this time effectively and strategically? Getting buy-in was another huge theme. So even though you may have experience and interest in using meeting science to make your meetings better, how do you get decision makers to see that value? How do you get your team to get participating in that? That's a great question. And then finally, remote meetings. How do you keep people engaged and make remote meetings effective when you're not even together? Well, we won't cover everybody's questions in today's presentation, but hopefully as you listen to Dr. Rogelberg talk, you'll hear some clues. And let me tell you a little bit about more what you can expect and how you can get more questions answered. So today there's going to be a presentation and then we'll follow that with a Q&A. You can go ahead and ask questions and chat along in the chat. I'll be there with you during the presentation. But if you have a question you absolutely want to have answered, please add it to the Q&A box because that way I can find it and I can share that with Dr. Rogelberg when we get towards the end. And then for all of you who are wondering, if my connection's bad or do I have to drop off? Yes, we will be recording this presentation and we will share that recording afterwards. So with that, I would love to introduce you to Dr. Steven Rogelberg. He is the Chancellor's Professor at UNC Charlotte. He a professor of organizational science, management, and psychology, as well as the director of organizational science. He has published over 100 publications. He works with organizations all around the world to help them with their meeting effectiveness. And crucially for all of you, he is the author of the #1 must-read business book of 2019, according to the Washington Post and Business Insider, titled The Surprising Science of Meetings, How You Can Lead Your Team to Peak Performance. I had a chance to read this book over the weekend and I would recommend it, absolutely. Very useful stuff and a nice, quick read. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Rogelberg. Welcome, Dr. Rogelberg.
Why, thank you so much. Let me share my screen. All right. All right. Look good on your side, Elise? Okay, great. Well, it really is delightful to be here to talk to you about the surprising science of meetings. And please feel free, as Elise was saying, to share questions that you have and chat. Extremely happy to answer anything that you might have. So with our agenda, we're going to talk a little bit about meetings and meeting science, because there truly is a robust and, I believe, a surprising science of meetings. And this sets the stage for some practical implications for organizations more systemically, and then implications for each of you as leaders. And as I mentioned earlier, we will certainly have time for some questions. So thank you, Elise, for that introduction. One of the things that about me is I wear a lot of different hats. That's something that I thoroughly enjoy. And the hat that I'm wearing most proudly right now is my hat as a meeting team scientist. And as a meeting team scientist, I'm very actively engaged in research. I do a lot of different projects, had a lot of publications. And my goal was to take this science and other science and to distill it into evidence-based practices. And that's really kind of the vision and hope of the book. All right, so let's start by collecting some little data right now. So let's just focus on the very first question. How much time do most managers spend per week in meetings? So in your chat room box, just put an A, a B, or a C. Just put it in now. And at least
All
you
right,
can,
I'm
please.
seeing lots and lots of C's, which is 21 hours or more. Oh my goodness, and lots of B's.
Okay.
11 to 20 hours. That's a lot of meetings.
Okay. So definitely B and C are the correct. It's going to depend on the job level. Okay. So let's go to the second question and put an A, B, C, or D. So what percentage of employees complain about having too many poor meetings?
Oh, wow. Look at all those D's come flying in. I see some C's, but lots of D's in this one.
Okay. Yes, definitely D tends to be the modal response. And the interesting thing is, so as Elise mentioned, I've had the good fortune of presenting this work really around the globe. And D is the modal response. No matter what country I'm in, that seems to come up the most. So now let me share with you some actual data. And so to me, the best work has been done by Elise in terms of the amount of meeting load. So we estimate, based on her calculations, that there are around 55 million meetings a day in the US alone. Our research generally shows that most professionals have around 15 meetings per week, but as you move up the organizational hierarchy, that number just increases. We definitely have people in our data sets that have upwards of 30, 35, 40 hours of meetings a week. And at the same time, frustrations abound. Too many meetings is consistently identified as one of the #1 time wasters at work. So you have this incredibly high base rate activity. And at the same time, this incredible amount of frustration. So when you put those together, you could say, well, we're both living and dying in meetings. Now, for me, I see this as an incredible opportunity. Anytime you have a very frequent work activity that people are not seeing that they're getting full value add, I see this as just a prime candidate for improvement. So can research provide some help? Well, hopefully the answer is yes, because I wrote a whole book on it. So absolutely, research can provide help. And there's so much out there. There's research that folks have done comparing stand-up meetings to sit-down meetings. And which one do you think is better? Well, interestingly, they actually produce the same quality outcomes, but the stand-up meeting takes half as much time. Pretty interesting. Then there's research on meeting satisfaction, because yes, there is someone very satisfied with their meetings, and that's the person leading the meeting. They tend to have a different perception, but then again, why wouldn't they? They're controlling the experience and they're participating the most. So for example, I think this webinar is going really great, but then again, that's just my lens because I'm in control. One thing worse than starting late to a meeting. So Elise did a great job starting us on time, but something even more important, our research suggests that ending late is highly problematic and causes incredible distress in employees and obviously sets them behind for their next set of meetings. Another set of research has examined the role of silence in meetings. Interestingly, I just saw on my computer, Business Insider ran a piece, a chapter I wrote in my book around silence. And I'm really intrigued by how silence can be leveraged in meetings. Interestingly, when you have people brainstorm in silence and in writing versus brainstorming verbally, we find that when people brainstorm in silence, twice as many ideas emerge, and those ideas actually are rated as being higher quality and more creative. So silence is another valuable technique. So let me give you a taste of some other work I have done to help set the stage for some implications. So first of all, early research, is the negativity around meetings warranted? And in one of my first studies, I took meetings into the lab. And the goal was to have these folks come together and solve a problem. And because they were in a lab, I was actually able to score the quality of the decisions that they made in the meeting. Interestingly, the typical meeting yielded a decision that was higher quality than the average person in the meeting. So if you could identify the average person, team decisions typically were better than that. However, in only 10 to 15% of the time did the team decision surpass the decision quality of the best individual. So it's better than the average, but not as good as the best. So this is kind of a bad news, good news story. The bad news is 10 to 15% is not very much. This is quite concerning. But the good news is it can happen. It can happen. The team can derive decisions better than the best individual. So it's there. The potential is there, which I think is quite energizing. Let me kind of change gears and tell you about another study I did. In this study, I had people keep a diary for a week. And at the end of every day, they indicated in this diary how many meetings they had, how much time they spent in meetings, and then also their feelings about their day. Was it a good day? Are they fatigued? Did they accomplish much? And what we found is that the more meetings someone had in their day, so just the sheer amount of meetings, that they reported more fatigue and more feelings of work. Now this is interesting because you hope that meetings are designed to accomplish work, but we find kind of just the opposite, that when they have lots of meetings, they feel like they have even more work to do. But, and here's a piece of good news, is that higher quality meetings help to mitigate the negative effects of having too many meetings. So that's kind of uplifting, that when meetings are done right, that same level of drain and fatigue doesn't appear to happen. Also did research looking at job satisfaction. Was really interested in the role of people's experiences in meetings and how they feel about their job overall. And what we found was one of the most significant predictors of job satisfaction was actually their satisfaction with meetings. And this was even after controlling for their feelings towards their boss or their peers. You could still very, very effectively predict someone's job satisfaction based on their meeting satisfaction. So meetings go beyond just people's feelings about the meeting in and of themselves. All right, last study, and perhaps the most important. This study tried to link meetings with employee engagement. Now we know employee engagement is just so incredibly critical, right? So when employees are engaged, performance is better, they help other people, they tend to be not have as much turnover, all kinds of positive outcomes. So we want to do anything we can to foster employee engagement. And in this study, what we did was we linked how their supervisors ran their meeting with how employees feel from an employee engagement perspective overall. And this was a study over time. And we found a strong connection. Basically, those employees who reported that their leaders were much more effective at calling relevant meetings, leaders who managed time effectively, starting on time, ending as expected, but most importantly, those leaders who were able to create freedom of speech within a meeting, well, leaders who were engaging in these meeting practices, employees reported overall higher levels of engagement. So therefore, what takes place in a meeting fundamentally affects employees' overall experiences of engagement on the job. So when you put this all together, and you have to come up with just 2 words overall to kind of sum up this research, what you get is meetings matter. Meetings truly matter. Meetings done wrong have tremendous dollar costs. And again, Elise has done some fantastic work on this front. Meetings done wrong lead to disengagement, frustration, and even meeting recovery syndrome. And this is the idea that when you have bad meetings, well, you just don't leave those bad feelings at the door, that they can stick with you and often lead to rumination and co-rumination. But on the positive, these data also suggest that when meetings are done well, they are incredible opportunities for inclusion, innovation, engagement, and return on investment. All right, so now let's move into practical implications. So who's responsible for improving meetings? Who owns meetings? Who needs to make positive changes? Well, each of us, every single one of us, we all have meetings that we run. So clearly the responsibility for making things better lies for all of us. We can all do something to make them better. And I'll come back to that very shortly. But also the organization through its system. So let me give you a taste of what I mean on that front. So first of all, the most successful organizations try to identify the return on their meeting investment. They've designed they have an engagement survey that asks some questions about meetings. I often go into organizations to do these audits. So they do something to see whether they are getting full value from meetings. Interestingly, I have presented to a lot of different CEO groups and chief human resource officer groups, and these are Forbes 500 companies, and I've always asked people, how many people have on their employee engagement surveys content around meetings? And I have yet to find one company. And this is quite a blind spot. We need to be able to track how meetings are going. When you have a metric, well, it creates focus. Then you can assess it, track it, hold people accountable. And this is particularly important because of that blind spot I mentioned earlier, where leaders are not always the best judges of meeting quality. And on the bottom, you can see some dashboards I created for some clients. And these dashboards basically kind of, help to create some accountabilities. MQ is meeting quality, and then some goals. They could track changes month to month. But the really nifty thing about meetings is you can identify real costs, right? So we know the actual costs of meetings based on the time and the salaries of the individuals. So you can see in the kind of the metric, the dashboard below it, we started to attach numbers and quantify, the meeting return. So the most successful organizations do something to track how they're doing with meetings. There's other things they can do. High fidelity training. Now, high fidelity training is really important. Now, when I say high fidelity, I mean that you need to fundamentally train people to facilitate an experience, and they have to practice that. All too often, people think that the basic training, such as have an agenda, is enough. But the fact is, it's not enough. Our research has shown that having an agenda in and of itself does nothing for meeting effectiveness, but yet people think they're doing something. It comes down to, how was that agenda created? Were folks consulted? What are the items on that agenda? Are they important and relevant? And most importantly, how is the meeting facilitated to achieve those agenda ends? So when it's high fidelity training, you can really push on the fact that it's these other pieces around the tactic of giving an agenda that really matter. And this fits well into this next piece, which is, as an organization, making sure that your onboarding programs and your high potential initiatives include some content around meetings. I've yet to find a company that's embracing this. And this is a big problem, because as you move up in leadership, you're basically a steward of more and more people's time, and therefore there's additional responsibilities. Finally, companies can shape cultural practices. A number of companies have actually created systems where you have to get approval for large meetings. Pretty intriguing concept. We know that dysfunction increases as meeting size increases. Therefore, this is an interesting practice that some companies have done. Some companies play with this idea of having meeting-free time, right? Where you can decrease interruptions and have what's talked about as maker's time. Now, sometimes people think of maker's time as only being relevant for those in more creative roles. I disagree. Maker's time is relevant for everybody. Every leader needs maker's time. Some companies have played with this idea of trying to change meeting cadences. So instead of long meetings, have huddles. And these practices can be extremely effective. So short 10-minute meetings to create alignment. And this can be paired with something that I call magic time, which is a time that everyone has designated on their calendar as being available to that team. And no one can fill that. It's there if it's needed. So you do things in huddles, you keep creating alignment, addressing problems in real time. And then if there's any vexing issues, they clearly can't be discussed in the huddle given time, well, they can be moved to this magic time. But with this type of system, it's often the case that half of magic time meetings actually get canceled. Conference room design. I'm intrigued by companies that actually build their conference rooms so that there's 2 screens. One screen can be used for a PowerPoint presentation, but then the other screen is basically a Google Doc where minutes are kept in real time, responsible individuals for various items are flown right onto that screen. Everyone sees it, is adding to it, and it becomes a very dynamic piece where you're increasing the chances that what was discussed actually happened. So those are some cultural practices that can have some really positive effects. But ultimately, it's about each leader improving one meeting at a time. And what I want to do now for our remainder of our session is kind of focus on this piece. And I thought what would be kind of fun is, before I share with you my top 6 pieces of advice, and it was kind of tough to find 6. Obviously my book has, I can't even count, but these are 6 I thought were really meaningful. I thought before I shared my top 6 that I would turn this over to you. So let's take a couple minutes, and I'd like everyone to reflect, and in the chat room, indicate what you see as a top piece of advice for a leader to improve their meetings. Okay, so give it a go. Reflect, and then shoot in the chat room a top piece of advice.
I'll be excited to see what people chat in for this one. We're seeing some good questions about how to help start measuring and collecting feedback on this.
Okay.
But feedback afterwards is not the same as the piece of advice you give to get started on it. So I'm seeing some answers come in now. One, Have a clear vision and purpose for the meeting and design the experience of the meeting with intention. Agendas and guidelines for decisions, that's fabulous. Oh, how about a mood gauge at the beginning of the meeting? Formats for high interaction among participants. Adequate meeting prep by sending out the pre-reading materials, etc. Being thoughtful, again, about the outcome and the purpose of the meeting and ensure the design is intentional. Being organized, getting hard data about your meetings from employees.
Love it.
Yeah, right? Teach and practice interactive verbal behaviors. Lots of prep work. Make sure everyone knows the results ahead of time. Again, a clear agenda and a determination about whether the meeting is strategic or tactical. So getting into some of that, what type of meeting is this? Being strategic about who you invite. Minimal talking by the leader at the beginning of the meeting. They don't mean webinars because we don't have a choice in those ones, and then clear closing. How do you get very clear about what happens next? What do we decide? What can we improve about the meeting? Lots of great tips there.
Perfect. Perfect. All right. Those are excellent. Well, thank you. Thank you for that. That was really helpful. All right. So let me share with you some of my personal favorites, and they definitely align very well with what you all shared. So my top 6. Number 1 is it starts with a steward mindset. And this is something I talk a lot about in my book, is getting leaders to recognize that when they're, as a leader, that they are a steward of others' time. And if you recognize that ultimately that you're this steward of others' time, well, that mindset has a tremendous impact on your choices. It impacts when you have meetings, what you put on that agenda, who you invite, and it impacts the choices you make with regard to how you design that meeting experience. So leaders fully embracing the perspective that they are a steward of others' time is a critical piece. That stewardship mindset will really drive all kinds of choices. So now let me tell you about some of these choices. Go for the smallest number of people possible in meetings. One of the things that we have found in research is that while people complain about having too many meetings, what often concerns them more is actually being excluded from meetings. This is kind of interesting, right? So if you're not invited, you wonder why, but then again, we lament having so many. So we want to have the smallest number of people possible because the bigger the meeting, again, as I mentioned earlier, dysfunction increases, social loafing increases. Social loafing is this idea that when we have more people around us, we tend to hide in a crowd as opposed to fully contribute. So there's some strategies we can do to think of meetings as, in a sense, as having primary members and secondary members. And primary people are those drivers, and secondary people are those individuals who want to be in the loop, but don't really need to be in the meeting, or at least the entire meeting. So you could, once you have this mindset, start to say, you know what, there are pieces of the agenda that are relevant to you, but then there are pieces that aren't. So let's leverage a timed agenda to honor your time. This could be done such that the first item on the agenda involves a broader group of people. You do that item and then those people leave. So that next thing you know, for the other pieces of the agenda, it's tight. You also, for those people who are more secondary, you can do some important diligence where you reach out to them and say, hey, we're having this meeting. The content touches upon your areas, but I fear that it would waste your time. So if you would like, I could provide you with the opportunity to share some of your feelings about the topics, and I will bring it up. I also promise you that I will share the minutes with you. And at any point, if you want to change your mind and come to meetings, you're more than welcome. What typically, when you show that level of respect and give people the opportunity for input and follow-up, then people are very willing to opt out. So you're able to kind of show that respect, but keep your meetings lean. So those are some techniques for kind of keeping to managing size. Very related, is length of a meeting. We want to make meetings as tight as we possibly can. Why are meetings 1 hour long? Well, that's the default setting on Outlook and Google Calendar. They can be changed, but it takes steps. And you know, when you put together the fact that we often meet for certain amounts of times in a very non-intentional manner, with Parkinson's law, which is the notion that work expands to fill whatever time is allotted to it. So a meeting scheduled for an hour magically takes 1 hour. But we can use this to our gain, right? We could say schedule the meeting for 50 minutes. And it will take 50 minutes. So we want to think carefully about setting times, but then I suggest backing them down 5 to 10%. We know from psychological research that humans actually perform better under some levels of pressure. Not too much pressure, but some levels. So by thinking through the amount of time and dialing it back, you're basically going to create a much tighter meeting experience where people are focused. And then the added bonus is you're going to return time back to individuals so they can carry on their other work. Number 4, be unconventional. Meetings are filled with so much habitual behavior. Sitting in the same place could be a great example. So an unconventional technique to make meetings more effective could involve, assigning seats. You could have name placards that you constantly shuffle and move in different places. Now you might say, well, that sounds really trite, but it's actually not. If people sit in the same place every time, communication flows actually become quite predictable. So we could be unconventional, move people around. We could have people work in dyads. So if you're brainstorming about something and you're in this big room and you say, hey, I want the best ideas, you're actually going to get a heck of a lot more ideas if you have people work in dyads. And then they kind of report out as dyads. I'm a really big fan of leveraging some technology. Various software companies have these clickers where you could have people vote on various options. So if you really want to know whether you have consensus or not, this is the best way of doing it. Having people, contribute ideas before the meeting, right? So if you know you're going to be, critiquing something or generating ideas for something, people can put these all in a Google Doc or in a SurveyMonkey, and then they can be brought up in the meeting. So instead of relying on the meeting to be the place of brainstorming, you can use the time beforehand. And we already talked about kind of using silence and people typing into ideas into a Google Doc. That can work really well. Meeting in different locations, again, helping kind of break some of the meeting habits so that energy stays fresh. And to Elisa's delight, even food can be very helpful to meetings. Now, it's not the food in and of itself, but it's what the food communicates, right? When we occasionally have snacks for people, it suggests that we care about them. It also allows for an easier transition from what they were doing before the meeting to the meeting itself. And that really connects us with the advice number 5. Our research shows that people often experience meetings as interruptions, right? Everyone's pounding out work, you have a meeting, it takes you away from that. It functions like an interruption. So we have to help try to mitigate the negative effects of an interruption. And as a result, we want to start meetings well. We want to start meetings with energy. We want to welcome people. Really what we need to see happen is that that leader has to embrace their role as a host. And as a host, if people don't know each other, you introduce them. As a host, you care about people's comfort and you make sure that they truly feel like that they're appreciated, that it's great that you made time to be there for this meeting. All right, so those are the top 5. And now let me share number 6. And this certainly came up in your comments. We know about this meeting blind spot. So we know that leaders evaluate their meetings better than anyone else. Therefore, if you really embrace this notion that you're a steward of others' time, then you're aware that this blind spot could apply to you. And as a result, you want to evaluate the meeting experience. You want to periodically give your folks a short survey. What's going well? What's going not so well? What can I do differently? Collecting data like that is extremely informative, but it also communicates to your people that you care, that you want to honor their time and to make the meeting the best possible experience that you can. All right, so as I mentioned, the book gets into a host of other topics, and some of them I'm sure we'll touch upon when we do our Q&A. But also, if you visit my website, thesurprisingscience.com or stephenrogelberg.com, I have my publications there. I have various other materials that can help address some of these topics as well. And I want to leave you, I think, with an optimistic message. Meetings are one of those things that given that there's so many of them, that even if we can just make 20% of our meetings 20% better, the incremental gains are just fantastic. And while we don't have control of others' meetings, we do have control of our meetings. We can make good choices. We can become exemplars and examples for others that hopefully they will then model. I think so much of the problem with meetings is the fact that people perpetuate the bad practices that they complain about. So with that, I think it's a good opportunity to stop and to address questions that you might have. And I just want to thank you for attending this webinar.
Fabulous. We definitely have questions, so I'm so pleased that we've got some time to handle them. Let's dive in. So first off, Sue Mitten states that in a university environment, many departments use Robert's Rules of Order. What's been your experience with this approach? Is it useful? And what can be done to suggest a different approach? In her opinion, that approach is too detailed and dated, and you might get better engagement with another way to set guidelines for meetings. I know that's a question I get asked about boards a lot, but I haven't had it in the university setting before. What's your thought on that one?
So Robert's Rules of Orders is a great technique for managing very large groups of people. But I am shocked at how often I see small departments, especially in academic institutions, embracing Robert's Rules. I don't think they need it. It's really designed to help address a problem that shouldn't exist in meetings under 12 people. But once you start talking about meetings with 20 plus people, well, you can see that maybe a structure could be very helpful. I look at Robert's Rules of Order as being a tool. And given what's the agenda, given the topic, given the needs, you might leverage that tool, but you might not leverage the tool. And so when you have this steward of others' time mindset, you recognize that you have a lot of different tools that you can use. And this is one of them, but it doesn't mean that you should do it all the time.
That's great. If I can throw in just one small thing on that one, we have, when I talk to boards about Robert's Rules, it's useful to point out the origin, which is those were invented during the Civil War, when people in a meeting would literally potentially come to blows. So they are the rules for maintaining order. And if you are not in a situation, like you say, where you need to maintain order, you don't need to treat people like that.
Yeah, so let's though make it a rule of thumb that any meeting with lots of people having guns and
yeah, Robert's Rules, man.
Yeah, let's definitely defer to that.
Yes, right. That's the sword length arm, right? Okay, so great. Next question. Have you looked at the science of meetings with regard to prep for the meeting itself? I've
Yeah.
been to a number of meetings where it's expected that pre-reads would be pre-read, but not everyone did that, so the meeting wasn't as effective as it could have been.
Yeah. So let me kind of tackle that in two parts. So first of all, there's the leader's preparation. And I would say that the modal preparation leaders have in preparing for a meeting is like no time. I don't think leaders really think much about their meetings. I think they dial it in. And we need leaders to think about the meeting experience. And it could just be 5 minutes, but 5 minutes of good reflection and planning can do wonders. So I very much encourage leaders to kind of think of meetings with their folks with the same diligence that they would have with meeting with customers, right? We don't ever dial it in with customers. We think about our meetings with customers. And that's what I want leaders to do. And leaders can even do something called a pre-mortem. And this is where you imagine that everything went wrong and then think through, well, why might that happen? And then make plans to prevent that from happening. So a pre-mortem could be a very useful technique for a leader to help plan the experience. Now, the other part of your question, which is really intriguing, is this idea of reading before the meeting. And, this is a big problem. Very rarely do everyone in the meeting prepare equally before the meeting. And this creates an uneven discussion and sometimes not even a helpful discussion. So I draw people's attention to practices in companies such as Amazon. And a common practice in Amazon is actually to build into the first part of the meeting silence and time to read the preparatory materials. This is pretty fascinating. So instead of expecting people to do it before the meeting, you take 10 or 15 minutes at the start of the meeting and people just do that preparation. Well, this is actually kind of very positive for the meeting leader, because then once you start the discussion, everyone's read it. You know that it's fresh on people's minds. So I've started to believe more and more in the value of actually leveraging meeting time to help be that preparation buffer. Now, in some cultures, you don't have to do that. In some organizations, people really do respect the preparation. The cadence of the work is such that they can do it. So you don't need to build in that buffer. But for some organizations, putting a buffer in that meeting to actually be preparation time can be very advantageous.
I sat next to a manager from Amazon at the last Metallica concert I was in. And he, in fact, said that he loved his meetings because they use that specific practice. Very cool. All right. So next question. Are there any case studies at an organization-wide level that we can refer to that show how positively these changes can impact how we spend our time together? Even in the short time I've been trying out these ideas, it's been a significant improvement, and it would help me bringing those ideas forward. Cool. I would love all the case studies about how important this is.
Yeah. There's really not, you're not going to find any published research that has, really looks at all these various pieces together and how it can move the dial. You can certainly find research and studies that looks at 1 or 2 or 3 things and how that moved the dial in an organization. I've even seen studies that looked at humor in meetings and found that, meetings where there's more positive humor actually resulted in a more positive bottom line for an organization. Interestingly, as an aside, the type of humor mattered. So if the humor was a negative humor that mocked people, that kind of humor actually had a negative relationship on organizational profitability. So you can find studies that kind of look at the various pieces, but holistically, it's harder to find the case. What I'm a big believer in is, and I think this is how I wrote the book, is there are a variety of things that leaders and organizations can do. And they don't have to do all of them. But if people start to become more intentional and experiment and try new things. Some of the things I talked about here or other things that you can find in the book. Well, as a collective, you're changing the culture. You're making the culture one that experiments, that grows, that learns, that reflects, that grows, that learns, that reflects. And that will ultimately result in an organization that has better meetings, and it will also spill over to other activities. In my case study that I wrote for the Harvard Business Review that just came out, at the end of the case study, you had this person trying to fix their meetings. And they did all these things and then reassessed with their people with a little survey. And in the case study, individuals reported that the meetings were better, but then they also said, but we have problems with X, Y, and Z. And at first the leader was really upset. They said, oh my gosh, I can't believe how negative these employees are being. But really what that leader did by trying new things and asking for feedback is they changed the culture in their department. They changed the culture such that people then felt safer to share more thoughts about more topics. And the best leaders, the leaders that don't derail, are those leaders who are constantly experimenting, learning and growing, trying new things and connecting with their people. Because, ultimately down the road, we can't do it ourselves. We have to do it with the collective.
Awesome. So perhaps as a way to start building some of those case studies, we have a question here that says, can you provide example metrics you use in your assessments? Because perhaps while there aren't case studies out there now, if people start to collect some of this data, they can have a baseline that they can then start to produce these case studies. So what do you collect that way?
Sure. So my book does have some, I do put in some metrics that can be used. I'm a big fan of, having people reflect on their meetings and kind of the percentage of time that's useful, that they feel engaged as it relates to meetings. So yeah, there's lots of metrics that can be used depending on how much real estate you have in your surveys. I've built audits and assessments that could just be 2 questions about the quantity and the quality of the meetings, to a much larger set that broke down how time was used for a variety of different meeting modalities, where this organization was doing well with face-to-face meetings, but they had much bigger problems with virtual meetings. So yeah, there's lots of different things that can be done. And most importantly is just to have something. As I mentioned earlier, that's just not the case.
Which of course is another one of the questions. Why do you think that meetings are usually omitted from engagement surveys?
I love it.
Why is this? And as I've looked around, I haven't found much material on meetings in MBA courses either.
No, I love the question.
Shocking.
Yeah, I know. That's a great question. And so my theory is that people have accepted bad meetings as a way of life.
Yeah.
It's just how it is. We're going to have bad meetings. And that's a defeatist attitude, because clearly meetings can be made better. And I don't think it's that hard, if it's intentional. So I think people have been beaten down. I think people have just taken it as the way of life. And as a result, organizations haven't been measuring it. With that said, I think the problem is also that in organizational structures, it's often the case that no one owns meetings. We don't have a chief meeting officer, right? We have chief operating officers, chief human resource officers, and meetings could fall under those people. Meetings could fall under chief technology officers, but it's not exclusive to any one function or person. Really, the only person that it's exclusive to is the CEO. And often CEOs just don't have time to be thinking about this. So I think how organizations are structured, by design, it can lead to meetings falling to the wayside. But I was asked, I did this NPR interview yesterday, and they said basically the question it was whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic. And I replied, I'm very optimistic. When I think about this book, when Washington Post named it the #1 leadership book to watch for 2019, I was in shock. How a book about the surprising science of meetings. And then it happened again with Business Insider. And, while it's exciting for my book, really as a meeting scientist, I'm just so excited because it means that there's actually an appetite for this. Yeah. And I've been spending 20 years doing research and working with organizations, and maybe the appetite is finally built up. And so maybe organizations will start building it into their engagement surveys. I kind of think we're on a cusp of some really good things happening.
That's very exciting, isn't it? You can feel the conversation changing a little bit, where it's not all, oh, meetings are a drag. It starts to be, how can we use this time to put it to good use?
Yeah.
So one of the other questions on that vein is, what if you're not the leader? Have you learned any interventions an attendee can use to mitigate a bad meeting as it's happening?
Oh, I hate this question.
Everybody hates this question, and we always get it. But you got to take it.
And I hate the question because my answer is so unsatisfying. The question's great, but my answer is not. Frankly, we're beholden to the leader. The leader has so much of the power. If that leader is experiencing that blind spot and doesn't embrace their role of a steward, you have very little ability. You can certainly model good meeting attendee behaviors and hope that they catch. Depending on your relationship with the leader, you could have a conversation offline about the meeting. I had one person recently write in a review of the book that this is a great book to read and a great book to anonymously leave in the mailbox of your boss.
It's passive-aggressive leadership.
So the bottom line is, as an attendee, we don't have much control in any one meeting. But I will remind you that you can be known for running great meetings yourself. So you can do a good job in what you do. And one of the things that we know that is those leaders who are very effective at running meetings, they're going to be more successful. And so as you gain more and more power in the organization and have your promotions because you know how to create an inclusive environment, well, your model will start to cascade. And that's where we have control.
So as an organization looks to spread some of those practices, are there suggestions about simple ways to gain feedback regarding meetings as you work to improve them? So perhaps as a participant, you don't get to lead, but maybe you have a mechanism for feedback. How should they be collecting that feedback on meetings? Or how should you be giving it? Yeah.
So, hopefully we have organizations, watching this webinar and say, hey, yeah, I need to do something in my engagement survey. I need to periodically do an audit. So that's one feedback mechanism. Then hopefully you have leaders who recognize that, gosh, I'm a steward of others' time. I need to see how I'm doing and administer some survey to attendees. Again, it can be extremely simple. What am I doing well? Not so well? What can we do better? Even an interesting pre-survey where I have leaders I've worked with where they're creating task forces and then they administer a survey to people basically asking, what meeting practices do we want to have? What are things that we want to be sure we do and avoid to be successful? So I think those are your primary mechanisms, right? So the organizational system having engagement surveys or audits, or enlightened leaders doing it. And again, I keep coming back to that if your leader is not doing it, well, if you have a standing meeting, well, do it with your folks and keep being the exemplar, keep being the light and the model that hopefully others will come to follow.
So when you find people who are the light and the model, as you're shifting these habits, what do you recommend to help motivate and reward new behaviors and habits around meeting planning, participation, and execution? How should an organization celebrate that change?
Well, so it's going to start with assessment. So if you recall some of those dashboards that I shared earlier, those are dashboards are broken out by teams or departments. And like anything on an engagement survey, those departments that are excelling on certain dimensions get recognized. They get recognized by the supervisors of those individuals, and then they start to become models for others. People can benchmark with those groups as well. So I think a lot of the recognition for doing meetings well as an organization is going to stem from first assessing and taking some meaningful time to assess effectively, and then creating those dashboards, and not only focusing on those departments that are not doing so well, but then to truly celebrate those that are doing well.
Excellent. That would be fun to see. I would love to see if anybody puts that into practice and you start having assessments and benchmarks and celebrations. We'd love to hear about it. We would love to feature that. That would be really cool to learn about.
Doing these dashboards for organizations is incredible. I've really loved doing them, and it just changes the conversation. Right. Once you have a dashboard, then people want to move the dial on the dashboard. And think about the Fitbit revolution, right? As soon as we start measuring something, we're going to start moving. And it's moving not only in steps, but moving in action to making meetings better.
Yeah, very Deming. Yep, very cool. So let's dive into some really specific things. We've been looking at this broad organizational level. Let's talk about some specific meeting challenges. One, do you have any insights about the consequences of midstream meeting cancellation for learning about meetings gone wrong or counterproductive? So you've got people who show up late, or there's a false start, or it's a counterproductive behavior, and you cancel it.
So the meeting's already started, and you basically, it's not going well, and you say, hey, let's stop. Is that kind of what you're referring to?
I believe that's what the question refers to.
Okay. There are absolutely times where a meeting should stop midstream. If a meeting is coming off the wheels, coming off the rails, if some bad dysfunctional conflict is emerging that you don't have the skills to manage, that might be a good time to stop and to regroup and talk to these individuals and make sure you do it right. If energy has completely waned and people aren't engaging, then you stop and you can say, hey, this has been a good meeting up to now. Why don't we stop and move on? So there are times where it is best just to stop. I would also suggest, however, that if someone finds that this need is emerging, most likely their meetings are too long. Also, I think we forget that meetings should have more breaks in them. If we don't want people checking their technology, we might want to stop 30 minutes in and say, hey, let's take 2 minutes and everyone just kind of do your thing for 2 minutes, stand up, stretch, and then let's get back to work. We build so many of these experiences without breaks. Another example is standing up. I very much support the idea, and there are certainly cultures that do this, of just having people feel empowered to stand up at any point during the meeting. I just stand up. And that's another way of keeping energy levels high. So I think we want to think carefully about our meeting times. I think we want to think carefully about the techniques that we're doing to execute those meeting times and make sure that we've planned a diverse experience that not only asks for energy, but gives some energy back.
That's wonderful. And we are Speaking of meeting times, right here at the very end of the hour, we have a couple of last questions. I will try and make sure these get to Dr. Rogelberg so that he can contribute answers, and we can maybe send some answers in the email to follow up. Would that be all right with you?
Sure.
Fabulous. You know, I am so grateful you're here. For me personally, I'm really taking away this idea of steward leadership. I love that phrasing. Everybody on there, if you want to leave a last little note for Dr. Rogelberg about your key takeaway, your one thing that you're really going to grab from this and use in your work and bring back to your teams, we would love to see those in the chat. And with that, any last thoughts from you before we call it done?
No, I'm really, it's an honor to be here. You know, Elise does really terrific work, and tries to, you know, live in the world of both science and practice, and it's super commendable. And just to remind folks, come check out thesurprisingscience.com, and I think you'll find some good stuff there, and I hope you enjoy the book.
All right.